In 2542, the inaugural Invictus launch week saw Navy ships visit every system in the United Planets of Earth, UPE. Amidst the First Devaran War, people gathered in massive numbers to celebrate and send off the brave recruits who boarded large military transports to be taken to basic training. Navy officials noticed that these large gatherings were becoming more and more popular, system after system, and realized that the event could serve both a practical and political purpose. From there forward, Invictus would be both a chance to pick up new recruits, celebrate the Navy, and, eventually, show off the latest additions to its fleet. 5 centuries later, despite undergoing significant changes, Invictus Launch Week has become a cherished Empire-wide tradition. Today, instead of transporting volunteers, the event showcases the latest vehicles in the naval fleet while celebrating that year's recruits, and graduating officers and pilots as well. Still, the core values of the event have remained focused on driving recruitment and honoring the brave starmen who've dedicated themselves to protecting the Empire. Few systems discoveries have changed the trajectory of human history more than Elysium. On November 15, 2541, Dr. Keller Lynch returned after charting the first jump into the system to report that it teemed with advanced alien life, now known to be the Devaran. Unfortunately, unlike humanity's previous 2 encounters with a new culture, this one would quickly lead to war. Unprepared for the Devaran Blitz and their ship's powerful phalanx shields, the UPE Navy found itself on a defensive war, and in desperate need of starmen to build an effective fighting force. Navy brass met with the UPE's governing tribunal and high-ranking senators to not only seek ways to attract recruits, but to solve the logistical problems involved with transporting volunteers to basic training. As ship ownership among the public was rare and commercial space travel capacity and security was not sufficient for their needs, a hybrid idea emerged, where Navy ships would visit the populated planets in each system and pick up new recruits, while also projecting power and security to the populace. The recruits' ultimate destination being a base on Mars called Invictus, which inspired the event's name and stuck even after the base closed in 2579. Invictus ran for a week every October during the First Devaran War from 2541 to 2546. In 2547, the first Imperator, a First Devaran War hero by the name of Ivor Mezer, insisted that even though the war had ended, the event be held again to celebrate humanity's victory. From the event on Earth, Imperator Mezer emphasized the importance of sacrificing oneself for the greater good of the Empire and promised that the Navy would be used to defend the newly renamed United Empire of Earth, UEE, against threats both alien and domestic. Over the next few decades, people still gathered to see the Navy ships and celebrate that year's of local crop of recruits. But the supporting events varied greatly depending on the system, as there wasn't an active war or a unifying theme. That changed in 2581 when Imperator Mezer, faced with a declining Navy recruitment numbers, turned Invictus into an official holiday meant to celebrate the Corps. Under the Navy's direction, large and lavish ceremonies were planned to coincide with the ships arriving in system. New recruits now hopped aboard ships to Borea in the Magnus system, which housed the Navy's main shipyard, until 2632, when the Navy moved its shipyard to MacArthur in the Killian system, where they still reside. As an annual event, Invictus continued to evolve and expand, with some landing zones getting elaborate expo halls to showcase ships and advanced technologies. Seen by some as a way to attract technophiles to the Navy, and by others as a warning to those who would dare come up against it. Throughout the 26th century, the Navy was tasked more and more with dealing with political dissent and what was deemed by the government as domestic unrest. Not all welcomed the military and saw the unbridled propaganda of Invictus as another opportunity for the Mezer regime to push its authoritarian ambitions. Historians consider Invictus posters, banners, and recruitment vids from the early 27th century events prime examples of Messer-era agitprop. Surviving pieces either reside in museums or are highly sought after by private collectors. The public pushback to Invictus peaked in 2637 when the Terra system abstained from the event in protest of Imperator Liva Mezer III, using previous events to promote her growing pro-military agenda. Instead, the system hosted a counter-event that featured a famous speech by Terran Senator Asan Kiran, who rallied the crowd around the idea of Terra sovereignty. In 2681, the Navy dropped one of the core elements of Invictus and ceased using the event to pick up recruits to transport to training. From there forward, Navy recruits have been required to self-report to Killian. This led to an overall numbers of Invictus events being reduced, as Navy ships no longer needed to visit every system. Instead, larger, more focused celebrations were held at various major landing zones across the Empire, rotating locations each year. These larger Invictus events usually include vast recruitment centers that aggressively courted volunteers to fight the new danger from the edges of the Empire. And of course, we all know that as the Vandal. The now classic vid, All Tomorrow's Guardians, which centered around Navy personnel and the tactics they used in these recruitment centers, featured a Vandal attack on an Invictus ceremony in Angeli for its dramatic finale. Many at the time saw the vid as traditional Mezer propaganda, but it has since earned a reputation for having a subversive spin on the events and the politics of the era, and a subtle skewing of the character's depiction as Mezer loyalists within the Navy. The intense recruitment drive, alongside the public's growing weariness of the Mezer regime, led to a significant drop in Invictus attendance in the late 2730s. Embarrassed by the lack of public support, Imperator Galler Mezer IX would make attendance of the Invictus mandatory beginning in 2743. In a strange twist of events of the original intentions of the Imperator, Navy ships were used to pick up and transport people to the celebration closest to them. Invictus events soon featured large, sometimes unruly crowds that mingled about the halls just as long as required. Some used the free flights to plan family reunions. Anti-Mezer activists used the massive crowds to meet, exchange information, and in some systems, with lax security, used the flights to plan sabotage operations or recruit new members to the cause. Imperator Mezer IX's attendance mandate only lasted 2 years, before being replaced with a law that deemed missing the event unpatriotic behavior, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The law was rarely used in connection with the actual event. More often, it was used as justification to arrest anti-Mezer activists that the regime couldn't pin charges on. The legal mandate lasted until 2792, when the Mezer regime finally fell. The importance of Invictus actually increased following the fall of the Mezers. The Navy found itself in desperate need of recruits. After purging its ranks of Mezer loyalists, and in 2794, would move the event to May in order to repopulate its numbers as soon as possible. To further separate the event from its negative reputation, Imperator Aaron Toy worked with Naval High Command to reshape the message of Invictus away from the old display of military dominance into one of hope and serving the greater good. Aggressive recruitment centers were replaced with aspirational dioramas depicting moments when the Navy came to the aid of the Empire. The turn toward becoming a popular, family-friendly event continued in 2803 when the famous 999th 10th Squadron began performing exhilarating aerial aerobatics at select ceremonies. Most embraced the celebrations of modern Invictus Launch Week events as informative, entertaining, and fitting tribute to the Navy and the starmen that served the Empire. Yet it's not without its critics, who believe the cost is too exorbitant for taxpayers. They also argue that the event has become too commercialized and amounts to free marketing and essentially a government endorsement of a ship, weapon, and component that manufacturers would be having featured on the show floor. Still, Invictus remains one of the most beloved and widely attended events in all of the UEE, a chance for people to support the Navy, which is full of the pilots of the community and sacrifices that they are recognized for, that hopefully result in the safety of the Empire. This has been an adapted reading by RedJay of Portfolio Invictus Launch Week, a history, and it was originally in Jump Point 10.05. So this is a newer Jump Point, new-ish, I should say, and it certainly highlights some pretty interesting things. The change from the UEE, change to the UEE, I should say, from the UPE. I'm a little tongue-tied tonight, I'll be honest with you. I did a lot of takes of this one. And I still figured I'm going to go forward with it and just have some fun with it. And yeah, this is one of those that'll be saved in editing. For those who haven't tuned into these before, I tend to do these after hours type talks. Let's call them overtimes, I think I usually call them. And this is kind of me just kind of talking about the commentary of the intentions behind it, both of the lore team building these, and then also the actual in-lore discussion too. And if you ever have any questions, please put them below or reach out to me on Discord, RedJay #0001, as always. So the story of this is oftentimes when you go back a couple hundred years into the StarCitizen lore, you immediately find many stories of the Mezzers. And one of my favorite statements is the Mezzers make messes. You can see here that they had forced almost conscription to celebrate Invictus, and that didn't last too long. And literally, separatist groups sabotaging ships and attempting to recruit at these things shows the double-edged nature of bringing people out and especially forcing them to participate in an event. I think it is interesting also that entire star systems like Terra would step up and basically say, we don't want to be part of Invictus if it is this deep into the Mezzer propaganda and that word agitprop, which is basically just, it's basically Mezzers attempting to use this as a pedestal to have their vision of what the Empire should look like, and basically, let's be honest, the nepotism of their organization constantly pushing their family's agenda. I don't think I've ever read one story where the Mezzers actually had something in the goodness of their heart they did for the Empire, but I guess that strong person philosophy is something that is interesting of the Mezzers, and it certainly makes them the cartoon villain of the history of the UEE/UPE from earlier we talked about. And yeah, I mean, like, they basically ran the UEE Navy, so it makes sense that the Invictus would certainly be heavily influenced by the Mezzers. And also, the Mezzers in other stories we've talked about were very careful about who could purchase military hardware and how much of it and where they kept track of those things. In fact, the mobilization initiative that was part of the militia, the support of the UEE advocacy, is actually a pretty recent concept. And more modern ships like the Polaris and such were really not meant to be used during the Mezzers regime. This is me speculating now, but I would suggest that the Mezzers would not want that much power in the hands of an organization that may not have 1,000% loyalty to them. Having the idea of a group of size 10 torpedoes, that many, being packed into a quasi-capital vessel, and being able to disrupt possibly or stand against Mezzer agenda is no good for them. They literally say it that the during the time of the 2547 initiative, you have Imperator Mezzer, the first of the group of Ivor Messer specifically, the first of the Mezzers who reached Imperator, speaking about how the UEEs, the newly formed Navy, is standing against threats both alien and domestic. That's a direct mention of what he feels is truly the threats to his regime, especially post-war. Um, it's human nature to gear up towards work towards something, and then when the work is completed, you scale back, you look at new initiatives, you try to move on. And in leadership cases, it could possibly be the equivalent of a wartime leader versus a peacetime leader. And the Imperator is setting the tone, saying, I'm not dropping this, I'm not leaving, I'm not changing my ways. I want to keep promoting this strong military, and its priorities are not just alien in nature, which is the war. Remember, the war they just left. The Devarin are an alien species that we met and then immediately started fighting, unfortunately. And they're now relatively friendly with us. That's one of the cooler things of most of the alien species. I've mentioned this before, but the Xi'an and the Tavaran, we have these treaties with them. We have these relations that we've built up. Um, the Banu are actually somebody that we're much more familiar with, and we've seen a little bit of, and I've done quite a few of their stories, and A Gift for Baba is one of my favorites. If you want to check that out, it's a very long read, but I had a blast making that one. Great dramatic reading of that. Uh, and I can tell you that the Banu have been kind of like institutionalized in our stories and in our lore in a way that's almost like where they're approachable. And really, there's a lot of things that we don't know about the Banu. For starters, the Banu are willing to trade with anyone, as in also rumored the Vanduul. They get their hands on components of Vanduul replica craft, and there's no explanation of where they're getting them from. Um, this is my speculation again. I believe that it will be revealed in maybe Squadron or in the PU or something like that throughout a quest storyline that the Banu are secretly dealing in information and such for the Vanduul, which would explain why they know so much about us. Maybe even dealing in prisoners of war or something like that, on both sides. I don't know. But that's me speculating, complete speculation. So even if that's even a question, and the fact I can even suggest that means that they're not really our best friends, are they? Um, that being said, I own a BMM, a Banu Merchantman, and I love the Defender. The Defender is one of the coolest ships in the game to me. I love its quantum capability, the quantum effects it has. I love the style of it. I love the fact that it has an extra seat that makes it feel like it's not just a redundant ride along seat. It actually feels like its own little cockpit off to the side. It has both beds. It's a fantastic ship. It's a well thought out ship, and it still feels alien. It still feels unique. I love their hardware. Um, they make me nervous, not because of how they look, not because of how their stuff looks, because of their behavior, because of their choices, because of their privacy about who they deal with, including our enemies, and that always makes you feel a little on edge. I don't feel the same way. Back to topic. I don't feel the same way about the Devarin or the Xi'an. Um, they do have some cards close to their chest, but they're not literally doing deals with the Vanduul and dealing in people. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, the Banu certainly, I feel like they'd be like one arm away from me constantly. I love your hardware, but you stay over there. So, uh, we did a little bit of world hopping too in this discussion. It's a pretty short article, but I mean, the old shipyards in Borea and the Magnus system is pretty dang cool because we think of it as this ancient place, right? But in the grand scheme of the history of the verse, it's not that long ago. This whole article of only 7 paragraphs, I think, before I scripted it, it's covering 500 years. That is mind-boggling to me. And when we talk about Borea and Killian, I mean, we're talking about only a couple hundred years. The difference, once again, Borea 2581, Killian, MacArthur's in the Killian system, I should say, is in 2632. Less than 100 years, new shipyards. And that's not even getting into the smaller shipyards and capital retrofit shipyards and stuff, like we always, of course, know about now in Orison in the Stanton system. And that's one of the coolest things of this story. The places we know, the places we've spent a lot of hours waking up in and traveling in and out of and trading with and blood, sweat, and tears go into, are going to become part of these stories more and more. That's exciting. I want to go and explore these places just as much as I want to fondly know the history of the places I know well already. So there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of interesting things. I think there's a lot more we can go through with the shipyard discussions and the UAE Navy and their changes, because honestly, it almost feels like they're very inefficient in how the UAE Navy handles themselves, and the UPE before that. It just doesn't feel like they're like this well-oiled machine. I feel like the CDF in general is a much more efficient creature that works alongside the advocacy to attempt to rally, well, in our out of game terms, the pilots, but in game terms, rally the residents of a system to come assist, because the Navy is so ineffective at being able to be everywhere all at once, which is once again is understandable, but that just means more so you need to be even more hyper efficient in how you manage your resources. You can't have ships parked in different places for good feels. You need to constantly move your fleets around aggressively to counter these threats. Especially, for example, Xenothreat. If we can't even handle a relatively small pirate organization, how in the world are we supposed to handle Vandul? Now, yes, it's once again jumping out of lore hat for a moment, and let's talk about just gameplay. It's really meant to be something that's entertaining for the pilots. It's meant to be fun for the community to get around and blow things up and have a legitimate threat. But the threat needs to feel bigger, because right now a single Idris should not have the UEE Navy advocacy and combined might of the CDF and all the pilots. Should not worry them at all, especially with a lack of support. Which, and side note, having the experience of dealing with these capital ships and such, they're not true capitals. One of the biggest problems is we have hit point pools instead of armor now. But ignoring that for a moment, if we also just talk about the fact that they split their damage potential. When they first started releasing these in-game events with larger and larger ships, they actually disabled focus fire. They made each turret target different things. The goal was, in the words of CIG's testing team, was to try to make the game more fun, because they were blowing up too fast. I think as more and more player ships get bigger and they come online, and support craft are more commonplace, I think it would make sense to start allowing these ships to have a little more teeth and be more of a threat. But back into lore, the fleets we're seeing and we're dealing with that are small pirate organizations wandering into extremely high security systems and barely having any contest is kind of weird. Just leave it at that. Even a few Idrises should not be scary at all. To the fleet. And that brings up, once again, the inefficiency and risk. Even in this event, you can see the goal of the fleet is to constantly move around from system to system to system to system to system in this attempt to try to build up recruitment and to try to drive them and to try to bring up those numbers they desperately need. And it brings up an interesting fact of the UAE. There are systems that have much larger populations than others. Stanton is an outlier. Stanton is a massively overdeveloped system in general, and all of the planetary areas within it. Just because I'm not going to use the S word like 50 times in a row. Um, are extremely overdeveloped. There's other systems that would. Dang it! I just did it. Sorry. There's other places in the verse that are going to be extremely Spartan in the number of people that you will find there. We did one story about a double flash system that's going to eventually become a black hole and envelop the entire system, and there's still people living there in these tiny little for the front row settlement, for example, which is in the first planet. The idea being that they'll be the first ones to be consumed by the light of this event happening, and there's scientists that are warily hanging out on the last planet in the system, and this is all something that's actually legit and part of the StarCitizen lore. And do you think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to move into that place? Do you think there's going to be a lot of people hanging out? I don't think so. I think that there is going to be a reckoning that needs to happen where, the lore hits the rubber, so to speak. The Tyrol system, I'll include it in the cards at the end, but the Tyrol system can go supernova at any moment. And the idea that you have you have people that are literally hanging out there, and now you put in a lore post that the UAE Navy is going system to system recruiting in a place that has been ready to go supernova and collapse at any moment in this binary star system and destroy the entire system, eviscerating everyone in it, might not be the best place to recruit solid Navy personnel, especially because most of them are hiding out from the AVO. So, or they're temporary residents that are just science interns that are just there to get some data, and they're setting up the sensors and they're fleeing the system again because at any moment this could happen. Something tells me that system's not the best place to recruit. And once again, it goes back to my theme of the UAE Navy seems to be very inefficient until kicking and screaming it has to get its act together. And I don't see it as a retreat, that the Invictus is held in one location a year and it moves around. And by the way, when we have multiple star systems, it's highly likely it will not be in Stanton every year. It'll move around, just like with Low being the core of the IAE and the spirit of IAE, and celebrating the ship modding community that comes out of there, along with, for example, with Crow's Customs. I think that would be really cool to start seeing it kind of become a traveling roadshow again, but just stick to one system each year, and the idea being that it's in a solid location. And just one last thing I wanted to mention. If you missed my video that covered quite a lot of this already, but in the End of the Fury video, I talked about how every one of the convention centers, once you're inside, the outsides look fantastic, but once you're inside, they all feel very close to the same. And I'm sure there needs to be some modularity and some ease of use to set up different things. Because think about it, they're actually deploying, set design a half dozen times or so each time we set these up. Because it's not just one, because every like 48 hours, they're swapping the manufacturer. But still, I feel that each of the internals of the convention centers should have at least a taste of the planetary landing location they're at. So once again, Orison, would be wonderful if it had skylights that would allow you to see the clouds. And yes, I understand there's technical limitations about where the actual site is when you jump on that elevator, but it wouldn't be terrible to do a skybox or have it, floating above all the rest of the things, and it's just literally separated from other places. It still can see the sky without it looking awkward. Once again, I think I mentioned this before, but Hurston could have very interesting climates from Hurston decorating the insides, and of course that faded gold effect of the HD tower. And each place could have these neat little effects that truly make it inside. And okay, now I'm going really off the wall, but it would be really cool to see in New Babbage an indoor ski slope, for example, or a snowboard slope. You know, um, ride the slope with Pico, that kind of thing. Um, that's obviously way down the line, but it would be cool to see these small little tastes of the place that it's celebrating, the place that the fleet is proud to represent, the fleet is proud to defend, the place that these recruits want call home, and it's being celebrated right alongside this new navy they're joining up with or being promoted in, as it spoke about in the article. Just a thought, just a thought. But yeah, all right. If you hung around this long and you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. To my long-term subscribers, thank you for sticking around. I make these videos as much for you as I do for myself. And as you know, I love making lore videos. They are my passion, even if they get like 10 views. Thank you all for sticking around, and I wish you a great rest of the launch week.